I'd like to give you an example of applying machine learning to an area that I work in my research, and it's that of brain-machine interfaces. Here, the larger goal is to develop advanced prosthetic devices. So these are situations where someone has lost, say, an arm. We'd like to replace that arm with a prosthetic device and have that device behave like and even feel like the original arm as best as possible. And our approach that we take is one where we establish almost a direct connection between the person's brain and the prosthetic device. The general approach, this is work that we do with monkey. We have not applied it to humans, although others in the research community have worked with humans. And what we do is we implant electrodes into an area of the brain called the primary motor cortex. This is an area that's really involved in muscle activity throughout the body. And these electrodes allow us to listen to either individual neurons or small clusters of neurons. And now these cortical neurons, they communicate with each other using sequences of pulses. You'll see terminology like spikes or action potentials, but they all mean the same things. The neurons will communicate different information using different rates of these pulses. And so the idea is to listen in on a whole set of neurons and then use a model to translate these sequences of pulses into an estimate of the intent for the human or for the monkey to move her arm. So here's a picture of that, a high-level picture of that setup. So this is a top-level view of the monkey. In our experimental setup, the monkey has her arm placed in an exoskeleton that allows her to move her shoulder in one dimension and her elbow. So she's making planar arm movements in the horizontal plane. This exoskeleton has two different ways of behaving. One is that it allows the monkey to move her arm around freely, and it allows us to record the arm movements. But the exoskeleton can also be powered and can carry the monkey's arm if we're in that mode. So the electrodes give us a picture of what the monkey is attempting to do. This is a representation of the data that we get from the electrode array. Time is running along the horizontal axis here, and then each row corresponds to an individual neuron or small groups of neurons, and the tick marks that you see correspond to individual action potentials. And you'll notice that there are certain neurons where we have a whole set of action potentials that come very quickly, and then there's some period of time where there's a pause. And so staring at this, this neuron has very much has that kind of behavior. There are a couple of other neurons down here that show this, but if you look more carefully, you can see more subtle changes in the firing rate of the individual neurons depending upon what time it is. And what these neurons ultimately are encoding is some sort of a notion as to how the muscles should be contracting in order to move these joints of the arm. So the idea that we're after here is to take a representation of the recent set of spikes and use a model to estimate what the intent is of the monkey. And intent here is in quotes because we really don't know what the monkey is thinking, but we'll try to estimate that anyway. And if we can do that, then we can turn around and use that motion intent to command the movement of the exoskeleton. So let's drill down into that a little bit more. So we're trying to make a prediction at some time t, and by prediction I mean that we might predict the position of the shoulder at this time t, or the velocity of the shoulder, or acceleration, or the torque that's being imposed on the shoulder. And we're going to make this prediction at time t based on some recent history of neural activity. A common way that this is approached in the literature is to chop up time into a set of discrete bins. Here we have 20 of these. Each one is 50 milliseconds wide. So this full time period here corresponds to a 1 second history of neural activity. And then for each of the bins, for a single neuron, we count the number of spikes that fall within the bin. So if I have 20 bins here and I have 50 different neurons, then amongst this entire matrix, I have 1,000 different counts that I can use to try and predict these motion quantities down here. So that's what's on the next slide here. So imagine taking that entire matrix and unwinding it into a single column vector. So this big F of t corresponds to all of those 1,000 counts. So this is a 1,000 length vector. And it turns out that we can use a linear model to make a prediction about the motion here. So x hat here at time t is our prediction of motion, and this w corresponds to the set of parameters that we have available to our model. I should say fi here corresponds to just one of these blocks. So that's a particular neuron at a particular time delay. So the equation down here, again, x hat is what we're predicting. G is just some sort of general function over that vector f. And for the linear case, this is one way to write that model. So those of you who've had linear algebra, f and w here are both column vectors. So when we evaluate this, we end up with a scalar prediction that we're making out here. The scalar form of this model looks like this. So we're computing a weighted sum of all of those individual spike counts, where each neuron and time delay has its own parameter wi. So there are 1,000 of these wi's in this model. These two forms are equivalent to one another. The book that we're using this semester sort of bounces back and forth between the vector matrix notation and the scalar notation. I'm going to try and stick as much as possible with the scalar notation for the purposes of lecture, but it's often very convenient to drop into this form. So for those of you who have not taken linear algebra, it's important for you to make sure you at least have a little bit of intuition that this means a sum of the products of the W's and the F's. Where did these W's come from? First off, there's a process of gathering data. And what we do is we present the monkey with a set of targets. She moves her hand to hit the target, and then a new target appears. And while the monkey is doing this, we can observe two things. We can observe the movement itself, and we can observe the corresponding neural activity. And this gives us a set of example inputs, neural activity, and motion prediction outputs. So neural activity and what the actual motion is. We can use this information to train up our W's. So here's a very simple algorithm for training up the W's for a linear model. So there's the model that we just talked about. And for any machine learning algorithm, we end up defining some sort of a function that we're going to optimize in some way. In this case, it's a cost function, and it's just a sum over all of these quantities here. This is the motion that we actually observed, and this is the motion that our model predicts. Ideally, these are the same thing, in which case this term is just 0. The cost function then is just the mean squared error between actual and prediction. And the ideal model is one where E is actually 0, and if there's any deviation between X and X hat, then E is necessarily going to be positive. The learning algorithm, the idea behind the learning algorithm is that it picks the WIs so that we make E as small as possible. For this type of linear model, it's very, and this cost function, it's very convenient in that there is exactly one choice for all the WIs that minimizes E. This is not the case generally, but it happens to be the case for this combination of model and cost function. And I should say that this is exactly what you're doing when you are doing linear regression. So once we've selected our WIs, then we can take new samples of neural data and do a couple of different things. One is we can make predictions about how the monkey is moving, and we can also use these predictions to drive the motion of the exoskeleton, which is our stand-in for our prosthetic device. Okay, so that's one nice example of how we apply machine learning to solve big problems. We'll actually have a chance over the course of the semester to play a little bit with this data set.